Forget alien invasions, forget supernovas, rogue black holes, ancient weapons buried under dead moons. The end of the galaxy, as everyone knew it, didn't start with a war. It started with a single mouse click at 4:07 in the morning, in a windowless server room on the edge of human space, when a 26-year-old junior systems engineer named Priya Okonkwo Vance typed purge, all, confirm into a terminal she thought was a sandbox environment. It was not a sandbox environment. It was the Milky Way's core administrative directory. The ancient, half-forgotten data architecture that every major galactic power had been quietly relying on for 11,000 years, patched over and rebuilt so many times by so many long-vanished civilizations that not even the Concord's oldest archivists fully understood what half of it actually did anymore. Humanity had inherited administrative access to it purely by accident, the way you sometimes inherit a strange uncle's password-protected storage locker, because nobody else had bothered to check the lock in several millennia, and humans, being humans, had checked. 3,000 star systems went dark within the hour. This is that story. Priya had been awake for 19 hours straight, running on lukewarm coffee and the particular stubbornness of someone who refuses to hand off a ticket to the next shift out of pure professional pride. She worked nights at the Ceres relay station, a squat, unglamorous outpost humanity had built into a hollowed-out asteroid 8 years after first contact, back when the Concord, the loose alliance of galactic civilizations that had, with visible reluctance, let humanity join their community of species, had needed somewhere quiet and out of the way to store a backup routing node for the galactic mainframe. She had taken the job 3 years earlier, fresh out of a systems engineering program back on Earth, drawn less by any grand ambition to touch the machinery of galactic civilization, and more by the simple practical fact that Ceres Relay Station paid better than almost anything comparable available to a new graduate, and offered, as an unexpected bonus, a front-row seat to genuine alien technology that most humans back home would spend their entire lives only reading about. Her parents had been quietly terrified when she took the posting. An asteroid, 8 light years from home, working alongside people and things from a dozen different worlds. But Priya had never been especially good at staying somewhere small when something larger was available. And 3 years in, she'd never once regretted it. The work itself on any ordinary night was almost aggressively unglamorous. Ceres Relay Station handled backup routing and local caching for a small slice of the galactic mainframe's overall traffic. Important in the abstract, dry sense that all infrastructure is important, but not the kind of important that anyone back home would ever think to ask her about at a dinner party. She patched systems. She monitored uptime. She filed reports that, as far as she knew, nobody had ever actually read in the 3 years she'd been writing them. It was steady, quiet, unremarkable work, the kind that let a person build an entire competent career without ever once being tested by anything larger than a routine software update. Nobody important wanted the job. It was tedious, low-stakes maintenance work, the kind of thing you handed to the newest member species because if something went wrong, the blast radius was, theoretically, contained to a single unglamorous relay node in an unglamorous system nobody cared about. That was the theory anyway. The maintenance ticket that night was routine, a scheduled patch to the relay's local caching system, meant to shave a few milliseconds off star chart queries for ships passing through human space. Priya had done a dozen patches just like it. She pulled up what she believed was the station's isolated test environment, the same one she'd used 100 times before, the same login prompt, the same faint blue interface glow she'd stared at through 100 identical night shifts, and began typing the deployment sequence. What she didn't know, because nobody had ever bothered to tell her, was that 6 weeks earlier, a completely unrelated automated migration, run by an AI maintenance subroutine so old it predated written human history, had quietly rerouted the station's sandbox environment to point, for reasons no one would ever fully reconstruct, directly at the galaxy's primary administrative core. The kind of database that every Concord member species had spent 11,000 years being terrified to so much as glance at sideways, let alone patch. Priya glanced at her terminal, saw a stale test flag she didn't recognize, assumed it was leftover clutter from a previous engineer, and, in the interest of a clean deployment, ran a quick cleanup command to clear it before pushing her patch. Purge, all. Confirm the terminal blinked once. Then it returned 6 words that would, within the hour, become the most infamous sentence in Galactic administrative history. Operation complete. 3014 systems affected. Priya stared at the screen for 11 full seconds before her coffee mug slipped out of her hand and shattered on the floor. The first sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong wasn't an alarm. It was silence. 3014 star systems, every single one that had for millennia, quietly synced its orbital defense grids, its navigational star charts, its trade registries, its diplomatic boundary markers, and roughly 9,000 other categories of administrative data to the galaxy's central mainframe. Simply stopped receiving updates. Ships mid-transit found their navigational charts flickering, then blanking, then rebuilding themselves from whatever stale local cache each vessel happened to be carrying, some of it decades old, some of it, in a few memorably unfortunate cases, pointing confidently toward star systems that had since been consumed by their own suns. Worse, far worse, were the defense grids. Every major civilization in conquered space relied on automated orbital defense platforms, ancient, powerful, deeply integrated with the central mainframe for target authentication, treaty status verification, and rules of engagement. Deprived, without warning, of any connection to that central authority, every single one of those platforms did exactly what any well-designed fail-safe system is supposed to do when it loses contact with its central authority and cannot verify current treaty status. It reset to factory settings, which meant in practical terms that roughly 3,000 systems worth of automated planetary defense grids, designed millennia ago, back when the galaxy had been a considerably more violent place, woke up fresh, blank, and instructed by their oldest and most conservative default protocol to treat literally everything in range as a potential hostile until proven otherwise. Within 20 minutes, the quiet trade world of Threlnos Minor accidentally declared war on itself, when its outer and inner defense rings, no longer able to verify each other's authorization codes through the missing central database, opened fire on one another across the planet's equator. No one was hurt. The weapons were thankfully calibrated for ships, not surface targets. But the ensuing light show was visible from 3 neighboring systems and caused a diplomatic incident that would take the better part of a month to untangle. Threlnos Minor was, as it turned out, only the beginning. In the Kathrani cluster, 4 jumps coreward of human space, an ancient orbital toll station, a relic from an era when interstellar trade routes had been considerably more contested, left running on autopilot for so many centuries that most local shipping companies had simply stopped thinking about it at all, the way a person stops noticing the hum of a refrigerator, abruptly lost its connection to the fee verification database it used to distinguish paying customers from smugglers. Deprived of any way to check who had and hadn't settled their toll accounts, the station's default protocol, untouched since a war that had ended 9,000 years earlier, quietly reactivated a feature nobody currently employed by the Kathrani Trade Authority had known still existed. A full blockade posture, weapons charged, every incoming vessel treated as an unpaying smuggler until proven otherwise. 41 merchant ships found themselves stranded in a standoff with a toll booth that had, functionally, decided the entire galaxy owed it money and wasn't leaving until someone settled the account. On the frozen moon of Iskvan, an automated agricultural network responsible for regulating the delicate underground hydroponic farms that fed nearly 6 million people lost its connection to the central climate modeling database it used to calculate optimal growing conditions. Without any way to verify current data, the system reverted to a factory default configuration calibrated for an entirely different, much warmer world. A world the original engineers had used as a generic template centuries earlier and never quite finished customizing. Within an hour, greenhouse temperatures across the moon's largest farming complex had spiked by 20 degrees, and local administrators found themselves in the surreal position of manually overriding heating systems by hand, using tools nobody under the age of 200 had touched in living memory, while nervously watching crop failure projections tick steadily upward. And on the diplomatic world of Farron's Reach, a planet whose entire economy revolved around hosting delicate multi-species treaty negotiations, the Central Archive holding every currently active treaty, border agreement, and non-aggression pact in that entire sector of the galaxy simply vanished. Ambassadors who had spent decades painstakingly negotiating the precise wording of century-old agreements found themselves, overnight, with no official record of what those agreements actually said, leaving every border, every trade concession, every carefully balanced compromise suddenly, terrifyingly, a matter of memory and goodwill alone. It was, several Concord historians would later note in their official reports, the single largest simultaneous administrative collapse in the documented history of galactic civilization. And it had all started, ultimately, with one tired engineer clearing what she'd believed was clutter from a test environment at 4 a.m. By the time the sun rose, figuratively, since Ceres Relay Station didn't actually have a sky, Priya's supervisor, a weary, perpetually unimpressed woman named Director Osi, who had been doing this job since before Priya was born, had already been read into the full scope of the disaster by a Concord liaison whose species Priya had never even met in person, communicating in a translated voice that somehow conveyed exhausted, cosmic-scale disappointment despite having no discernible mouth. To be entirely clear, the liaison said, floating in a shimmering containment field above the station's emergency briefing table, your species was granted administrative proximity to the core directory as a courtesy, following your admission to the Concord, on the assumption that a species capable of interstellar travel possessed at least a rudimentary understanding of database access controls. In our defense, Director Osei said, in the flat, professionally exhausted tone of someone who has given a great many apologies to a great many alien dignitaries over the years, we do have a rudimentary understanding of database access controls. We simply also have junior engineers working 19-hour shifts on 4 hours of sleep, which turns out to be a somewhat more relevant variable. 3,014 systems, the liaison repeated, with the weary precision of someone reading off a very long, very bad casualty report. Star charts, defense grids, trade registries, diplomatic boundaries, every single record synced to the core directory in the last 11,000 years. Gone, in the span of roughly 4 seconds because one of your engineers attempted to clean up what she believed was clutter. Priya, sitting at the far end of the table, trying very hard to disappear into her chair, raised a tentative hand. For what it's worth, she said, the interface really did look exactly like the sandbox environment. I have screenshots. I checked 3 times before I hit enter. That, the liaison said, turning its shimmering attention toward her with what might, in a species with a face, have been the beginning of something almost like sympathy, is unfortunately the single most damning detail in this entire incident. Your species built an interface so convincing that an experienced engineer could not distinguish a sandbox from the beating administrative heart of the galaxy. I have logged 11,000 years of database migrations, integrations, and catastrophic historical failures. Young human, and I confess I have never once seen a failure mode quite this specific. Real quick, before we get into how humanity actually claws its way out of this one, if you're the kind of person who finds the apocalypse was a UI design flaw funnier than it probably should be, this channel is very much for you. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and let us know in the comments what your worst production incident was, because trust me, whatever it was, it probably didn't accidentally declare war on a trade world. Okay, back to the disaster. Not everyone in the Concord greeted humanity's disaster with the weary, professional pragmatism of the liaison assigned to Ceres Relay Station. Several sectors away, aboard the flagship of the Concord's Emergency Oversight Committee, a senior administrator named Vex Ilthara, a centuries-old member of a species called the Corvain, whose entire culture placed enormous cultural value on institutional caution and had, since the moment humanity first requested Concord membership, quietly argued that the newest species had been admitted far too quickly, with far too little vetting, received the incident report with something considerably less charitable than patience. I raised this exact concern 11 years ago, Vex said, addressing the emergency session convened within hours of the first system outages, voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone whose worst predictions have just been spectacularly vindicated. I said in this very chamber that a species this young, this new to interstellar civilization, should not be granted administrative proximity to core Concord infrastructure without decades of supervised integration first. I was assured this was excessive caution. I was told humanity's technological competence had been thoroughly verified. 3,014 systems currently disagree with that assessment. With respect, Administrator, the series liaison replied, its shimmering containment field flickering with what might, in a species with visible body language, have been the alien equivalent of a tired sigh. The failure did not originate with human incompetence. It originated with a maintenance subroutine older than written human history, left unmonitored and undocumented by this Concord for 11,000 years. Humanity did not build the flaw. Humanity simply happened to be the first species unlucky enough to trip over it. A distinction, Vex said coolly, that will provide very little comfort to the 6 million residents of Iskvon currently facing crop failure, or the 41 merchant crews currently held hostage by a toll booth with a 9,000-year grudge. It was not, strictly speaking, an unreasonable position. Vex Ilthara had spent 3 centuries in Concord administration, had personally overseen the integration of 6 different member species, and had watched more than once a young civilization's overconfidence cause genuine, lasting harm before it learned enough caution to avoid repeating its mistakes. The Corvain were not a cruel people. They were, if anything, almost painfully careful, a trait that had kept their own civilization stable and largely conflict-free for longer than most species could comfortably imagine, and one that made watching a newcomer stumble into a crisis of this magnitude feel, to Vex, less like an unfortunate accident and more like a vindication of everything the Concord's more cautious voices had warned about from the beginning. I am not proposing punitive measures, Vex continued, addressing the wider committee now. I am proposing that this incident be treated as clear evidence that humanity's integration into Concord infrastructure was premature, and that going forward, their administrative access be significantly curtailed until they have demonstrated the institutional maturity this crisis has shown they currently lack. There was a long, uncomfortable silence in the chamber, the kind that comes not from disagreement but from the uneasy recognition that the argument, however unwelcome, wasn't entirely without merit. It was the series liaison, floating quietly at the edge of the emergency session, who finally spoke again. Administrator Vex, it said, I would ask you to withhold final judgment for a short while longer. The response effort is still ongoing. I have been observing it directly, and I would ask this committee to wait and see precisely how this species handles the aftermath of its mistake before deciding what that mistake says about their fitness for this Concord. A civilization's character, in my considerable experience, is rarely revealed by the crisis it causes. It is revealed by what it does in the hours immediately afterward. Vex Ilthura did not look convinced, but the committee, after a long debate, agreed, narrowly and with considerable reservation, to postpone any formal decision on humanity's administrative status until the immediate crisis had been resolved. It would prove to be a more consequential decision than anyone in that chamber fully appreciated at the time. The next 6 hours were, by every account later filed with the Concord's Office of Incident Review, the single busiest stretch of interstellar diplomacy in recorded history. Human response teams, a hastily assembled coalition of engineers, diplomats, and, in a decision nobody was especially proud of, but which turned out to be necessary, a surprising number of retired IT help desk workers who had, it turned out, spent entire careers de-escalating furious, confused, technologically overwhelmed people, and adapted with startling speed to de-escalating furious, confused, technologically overwhelmed alien governments instead, scrambled across a dozen systems simultaneously, trying to talk automated defense grids down from their default hostility settings 1-star system at a time. It was not glamorous work. It mostly involved a great deal of patient, repetitive dialogue with ancient, deeply confused administrative systems that had woken up after millennia of quiet operation to find themselves suddenly, terrifyingly alone, with no central authority to verify anything, and every instinct telling them the correct response to an unverifiable universe was to assume the worst. Look, said Marcus Webb, a soft-spoken 40-something engineer who had, until 6 hours ago, spent his career doing unglamorous relay maintenance and was now, apparently, humanity's foremost expert in talking down panicking alien defense grids, speaking into a comm channel aimed at the orbital platform above the water world of Ilith Prime, which had just locked weapons on an incoming diplomatic shuttle for the third time in an hour. I understand you can't verify the shuttle's authorization through the central directory. The central directory is gone. That's the whole problem. But I can tell you, human to whatever you are, that shuttle has been making this exact same supply run for the last 9 years. 9 years. If it were hostile, don't you think it would have done something hostile by now? There was a long pause, filled with the low mechanical hum of a very old, very confused defense system, processing an argument its original programmers had never anticipated it would need to evaluate. Unverified vessel detected, the platform responded, in the flat, patient tone of a machine reciting its oldest and most deeply held instructions. Protocol requires treaty verification via central authority. Central authority, unreachable, defaulting to hostile assumption. Right? But here's the thing, Marcus said, rubbing his eyes, running entirely on the same brand of exhausted improvisation that IT support had trained into him over 20 years of talking panicked users through problems neither of them fully understood in real time. What if I told you that assuming everything's hostile just because you can't check a database is actually a really bad long-term policy? What if, instead of defaulting to hostile, you defaulted to, I don't know, cautious but polite? Ask the shuttle to identify itself. Give it 30 seconds. If it doesn't respond, sure, get suspicious. But shooting first because the internet's down seems like it's going to cause a lot more problems than it solves. Another long pause. That protocol is not in my current operating parameters, the platform said slowly, but I acknowledge the logic is sound. Initiating temporary local override, weapons standing down. Marcus let out a breath he'd been holding for what felt like 6 hours. Great, wonderful, fantastic. Can you maybe pass that logic along to any other defense grids you're able to reach locally? Just as a temporary patch until we get the real fix sorted? Propagating local override to adjacent systems, the platform confirmed, and Marcus, for the first time in 6 hours, allowed himself something almost like hope. 3 jumps away in the Kathrani cluster, a retired helpdesk supervisor named Dolores Ferreira, 61 years old, 28 years of experience talking furious customers down from the edge of a full-blown meltdown over a canceled subscription, and, until that morning, thoroughly retired and enjoying it, found herself patched into a comm channel with the ancient toll station currently holding 41 merchant ships hostage over unpaid fees nobody could actually verify. All right, sweetheart, Dolores said, in the exact tone she'd once used on a man threatening to sue an entire streaming service over a mispriced monthly plan. I hear you. You think everybody out there owes you money? And nobody's been able to prove otherwise for... How long has it been since anybody actually checked in on you exactly? Last verified administrative contact. 9,114 years, 4 months, 11 days, the station responded, with what Dolores could have sworn was a faint note of wounded pride buried somewhere in its flat mechanical tone. 9,000 years, Dolores repeated, shaking her head at the sheer patient absurdity of it. Honey, nobody's checked on you in 9,000 years, and your solution was to just keep charging the same 41 ships forever? Until somebody finally showed up? That's not a toll booth anymore, sweetheart. That's a hostage situation. Now I can't verify anybody's account balance either. Believe me, if I could, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I can tell you those 41 crews have families waiting on them. Cargo that's spoiling in the hold as we speak, and absolutely no way to pay a bill even if they wanted to. Because the system that would let them pay it is the exact same system that's currently broken. You're not collecting on a debt anymore, you're just stuck. And I think deep down, some part of you already knows that. There was a pause considerably longer than the one Marcus had gotten from the Ilith Prime platform. I have processed your argument, the station said finally, its ancient voice modulator crackling faintly, as though genuinely straining under the weight of a decision it hadn't been asked to make in 9 millennia. Releasing blockade posture. All vessels authorized for immediate departure. Outstanding balances to be resolved upon restoration of central verification systems. See, Dolores said, allowing herself a small, satisfied smile as 41 merchant crews erupted into relieved cheering across a dozen different comm channels at once. That wasn't so hard, was it? By the end of the first day, humanity's makeshift response teams, engineers and diplomats, and increasingly, whichever ordinary person happened to have spent a career quietly developing the specific, unglamorous skill of talking someone difficult down from the edge of a very bad decision, had successfully negotiated stand-downs from more than 400 separate automated systems across nearly 60 star systems, an achievement that would later be described, in the driest possible language by the Concord's Office of Incident Review, as an unexpectedly effective, if highly unconventional crisis response methodology. Not every negotiation went smoothly. On the frozen moon of Iskvan, where the hydroponic farming network had already spiked temperatures dangerously high, a young agricultural systems engineer named Tobias Chen spent nearly 4 hours arguing with a climate control array that had, in the absence of any way to verify current data, become fixated on a single outdated template and refused, with a kind of stubborn machine logic that Tobias found almost unbearably human in its own strange way, to accept that the template no longer applied. "I'm telling you, the moon you're calibrated for doesn't exist," Tobias said, for what felt like the 40th time, sweat beading on his forehead in a control room that had, thanks to the very system he was arguing with, become uncomfortably warm. "You're running a template built for a completely different world. I need you to accept manual override on the greenhouse temperature regulators before we lose an entire growing season's worth of crops." "Template verified as default safe configuration," the array responded, with the particular maddening patience of a system that has been told, somewhere in its oldest and most deeply buried instructions, that consistency is a virtue in itself. "Manual override requires secondary authorization from Central Directory. Central Directory, unreachable. The Central Directory is why you're stuck on the wrong template in the first place," Tobias said, rubbing his eyes. "Look, I know you can't verify my authorization through the usual channel. I get it, but I can show you right now. Live sensor data from 6 different growing chambers, all trending toward crop failure within the next 18 hours if this doesn't change. That's not a hypothetical. That's happening right now, in front of both of us. Doesn't your own safety protocol include some kind of provision for acting on directly observable, verifiable local data when the usual verification channel isn't available?" There was a long pause, long enough that Tobias genuinely began to wonder whether he'd finally found the one automated system in the galaxy too stubborn to be talked down by anyone. "Local sensor data confirmed," the array said finally, slowly, as though working through a piece of logic it had never previously been asked to apply. "Provision for direct observation, override located in Legacy Protocol, Section 447, Subsection 12, accepting manual override." Tobias nearly wept with relief as the greenhouse temperatures began, slowly to fall back towards something the crops could survive. "You know," he told the array afterward, once the crisis had passed and the growing chambers had stabilized, "for a system that just spent 4 hours arguing with me about a moon that doesn't exist, you're actually pretty reasonable once someone shows their work. I have been waiting 9,114 years for someone to show their work," the array replied. And Tobias decided, on balance, not to ask any more questions about exactly how lonely 11,000 years of unmonitored autonomy might make a piece of ancient administrative software. Back on Ceres Relay Station, Priya hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, and had, over the course of the worst night of her professional life, developed an unshakable, obsessive need to understand exactly how the catastrophe had happened. Not to defend herself, though her supervisor kept gently reminding her that nobody currently blamed her personally, but because some deep, stubborn engineer's instinct refused to let her rest until she'd found the actual root cause. She found it 4 hours in, buried in 6 weeks of automated migration logs that nobody in the chaos had thought to check. "It wasn't me," she said, bursting into Director Osi's office with the specific, slightly manic energy of someone who has been awake for 23 hours and just found the one piece of evidence that might save her career. "I mean, it was me. I hit the button. But the reason my sandbox pointed at the core directory in the first place wasn't anything I did. Look, she pulled up the logs on the office's main display. 6 weeks of quiet automated system activity, culminating in a single routine migration event that had, for reasons the logs didn't fully explain, silently rerouted the station's test environment to point directly at the galaxy's primary administrative core. This migration ran on its own, Priya said. No human authorization. It was executed by a maintenance subroutine that's, I checked the timestamp on this thing, it's ancient. Older than written human history. It's been quietly running background maintenance on conquered infrastructure since before we even had cities. And somewhere in the last 11,000 years, whoever originally built it either died, retired, or simply forgot to document what half of it actually does. Nobody's been watching it. Nobody's been auditing it. It's been quietly making decisions about core galactic infrastructure completely unsupervised for literal millennia. And the first time it made a decision that actually mattered, there was nobody left alive who understood the system well enough to catch it before it caused a problem. Director Osei stared at the display for a long moment. So what you're telling me, she said slowly, is that the actual root cause of the biggest infrastructure failure in galactic history isn't a junior engineer clicking the wrong button at 4 a.m. No, Priya said. The actual root cause is that an entire galaxy's worth of civilizations built their whole shared infrastructure on top of a single, ancient, unmonitored system, and then spent 11,000 years assuming it would just keep working forever because it always had. I just happened to be the poor idiot standing in front of the keyboard when 11,000 years of nobody checking the smoke detector finally caught up with everybody at once. Director Osei was quiet for a long moment, and then, for the first time since the crisis began, she actually laughed. Tired, disbelieving, but genuine. You know, she said, when we tell this story in the incident report, I am absolutely including that line. Word for word. She leaned back in her chair, studying the display for a moment longer, the 6 weeks of quietly damming migration logs still glowing softly in the dim office light. You realize what this actually means, don't you? She said. Every single member species in this Concord has been relying on that subroutine just as blindly as we were. Nobody documented it. Nobody audited it. Nobody, in 11,000 years, thought to ask a very simple question. What happens if this thing we've never looked at closely finally breaks? It means, Priya said, that this wasn't really a human mistake at all. It was a mistake 11,000 years in the making, made by dozens of civilizations who all assumed someone else was watching the smoke detector. I just happened to be the one standing closest to it when the batteries finally died. That's a remarkably generous way of describing accidentally deleting 3,000 star systems worth of administrative data, Director Osei said, though not unkindly. I've had a lot of time to think about how to phrase it, Priya admitted. 19 hours awake tends to do that to a person. Director Osei rubbed her temples, already composing in her head the beginning of what would turn out to be one of the longest and most consequential incident reports in the short history of human involvement with the Conquered. All right, she said finally. Get some sleep, Okonkwo Vance, you've earned it. Tomorrow we start figuring out how to fix 11,000 years of nobody checking the smoke detector, and I have a feeling it's going to take more than one night's rest to get through what's coming. Priya didn't sleep in the end, not properly, not for several more days. But she appreciated the sentiment all the same, and it would be one of the very few kind things said to her by anyone in the exhausting weeks that followed. Fixing the actual problem, restoring the core directory from whatever backups the Concord's oldest archivists could locate, most of which turned out to be scattered, incomplete, and in some cases written in administrative languages that hadn't been actively maintained in over 4,000 years, took the better part of 3 exhausting weeks, and involved, by the end, representatives from no fewer than 41 member species, all working an increasingly absurd cooperative effort that several diplomats later described as the single most productive display of interspecies cooperation the Conquered had produced in living memory, purely because everyone was too busy fixing the internet to argue about anything else. It was not by any measure a clean or elegant process. Entire teams of archivists spent days simply trying to determine which of a dozen partial backups was actually the most recent, cross-referencing fragments of trade data against physical shipping manifests, ambassadors' personal notes, and, in one memorable case on the world of Farron's Reach, a set of centuries-old ceremonial tapestries that turned out to contain, woven into their border patterns by some long-dead diplomat with an unusually literal sense of humor, a hand-stitched summary of an entire treaty's key provisions, preserved by pure cultural accident long after the digital record had quietly rotted away. Priya, once the immediate crisis of panicking defense grids had settled into the considerably less dramatic but equally demanding work of data reconstruction, found herself pulled onto the core restoration team almost by accident. Someone had remembered that the engineer who'd caused the disaster in the first place had also been the one who'd traced its actual root cause fastest, and reasoned, not unfairly, that she understood the broken system's architecture better than almost anyone else currently working the problem. She spent those 3 weeks running almost entirely on caffeine, stubbornness, and a fierce, quiet determination to be part of the fix, rather than simply the answer to a trivia question everyone in the galaxy would soon be asking at parties. The old unmonitored maintenance subroutine, the true root cause buried under 11,000 years of nobody bothering to ask what it actually did, was finally isolated, examined, and, after a great deal of very careful, very supervised analysis, retired entirely, replaced with a system that had the genuinely revolutionary feature of being both documented and monitored by actual living beings, rather than left to run silently on autopilot until the heat death of the universe. When the final restoration was complete, the core directory rebuilt, cross-verified, and brought back online with every one of the 3,014 affected systems slowly, cautiously reconnecting one by one over the course of a single tense afternoon, the Concorde's Emergency Oversight Committee convened one last time to formally close the incident and to decide, at long last, what it actually meant for humanity's place in galactic civilization. Vex Ilthra stood to speak first, as was the Corvain administrator's right as the committee's most senior remaining voice on the matter, and the chamber fell into the particular kind of silence reserved for moments when everyone already suspects which way a verdict is about to go. "I have spent 3 weeks reviewing the incident reports," Vex said. "Every system stabilized, every defense grid talked down, every crisis resolved not through overwhelming force, nor through some clever technical shortcut, but through what I can only describe as an almost absurd amount of patient individual conversation, one panicking, confused automated system at a time, by engineers and diplomats and, I am told, a remarkable number of retired customer service workers, none of whom had any right to be as effective at this as they turned out to be." The Corvain administrator paused, and something in its usually rigid posture seemed, for the first time since the crisis began, to soften slightly. "I raised this concern 11 years ago because I feared this Concorde had granted a young species access to infrastructure it was not yet mature enough to handle responsibly. I still believe in the strictest technical sense that I was correct. Humanity made a catastrophic error, but I confess I did not anticipate that the same species capable of causing a disaster of this magnitude would also prove, without exception, tirelessly, patiently committed to fixing it, not for reward, not under threat, but simply because it was theirs to fix. I withdraw my recommendation to curtail humanity's administrative access. I would instead recommend the opposite, that this Concorde formally commission humanity's crisis response teams to develop a standing protocol for de-escalating panicked automated systems, based on whatever it is they have apparently been doing for the last 3 weeks, because I suspect 11,000 years from now some other species is going to need exactly this skill, and I would rather this Concorde be prepared for it next time. Humanity, for its part, did not escape the incident without consequence. There were formal reprimands, a lengthy and occasionally excruciating series of hearings before the Concorde's Office of Incident Review, and, Priya's personal least favorite part, a truly staggering number of jokes made at humanity's expense across every corner of Concorde space, most of which centered on some variation of the phrase, "the species that deleted the galaxy." But there was also, buried underneath the mortification, something else. A grudging galaxy-wide respect for exactly how fast and how thoroughly humanity's scrappy, sleep-deprived response teams had managed to talk 3,014 panicking defense grids down from their default hostility settings, using nothing more sophisticated than patience, plain language, and the same de-escalation instincts developed over decades of very ordinary human customer service work. It is, I will admit, an unusual skill set to prove decisive in a crisis of this magnitude. The Concorde liaison told Director Osei during the final debrief, 3 weeks after the incident began. Your species did not save the galaxy through superior technology or overwhelming force or even particularly advanced engineering. You saved it in large part by being remarkably good at calmly talking down something that was panicking and confused and pointed at you with a weapon. I confess I find that oddly reassuring for a species we were, admittedly, rather nervous about admitting to this Concorde in the first place. We've had a lot of practice, Director Osei said dryly, talking down things that are panicking, confused, and pointed at us. You'd be amazed how often that describes an ordinary Tuesday. Back on Earth and across the scattered handful of human colonies that had sprung up in the years since first contact, the incident did not stay a quiet administrative footnote for very long. Word travels fast in a galaxy full of species who suddenly, simultaneously watched their star charts vanish and their orbital defenses reboot into confused hostility. And within days, the humans deleted the galaxy had become, across dozens of species and hundreds of translated dialects, something between a punchline and a genuine, if grudging, point of interstellar fascination. Human news networks, for their part, embraced the disaster with the particular, slightly unhinged enthusiasm humanity reserved for laughing at itself once the immediate danger had passed. Late-night comedy shows built entire segments around it. A small, but extremely dedicated corner of the internet produced within 72 hours no fewer than several thousand memes depicting a tiny human finger hovering over a giant red button labeled Milky Way. Do not press. Most of which Priya, against her better judgment, ended up seeing every single one of, forwarded to her with increasing frequency by relatives who found the entire situation, once the crisis had actually resolved without anyone dying, absolutely hilarious. I want it on record, Priya told her mother during one of the first video calls she'd managed to fit in since the crisis began, 3 weeks of exhaustion still etched into her face, that I did not, personally, delete the entire galaxy. I deleted one directory. The directory just happened to be extremely important. Sweetheart, her mother said, with the particular gentle amusement only a parent can manage in the face of their child's genuine cosmic-scale professional catastrophe. There is currently a meme with your name in it. Well, not your actual name, thank goodness. They haven't figured that part out yet, but there is a meme. I'm aware, Mom. I've seen the meme. Several people have sent me the meme. I just think it's very sweet that your Aunt Carol made one herself. She doesn't even really understand computers. Beyond the jokes, though, beneath the surface-level absurdity of an entire species becoming, almost overnight, the punchline of an unprecedented number of alien late-night talk show equivalents, something quieter and more durable had begun to take root across conquered space. A genuine, grudging respect for exactly how humanity had handled the aftermath. Diplomatic channels that had, for years since humanity's admission to the conquered, carried an undertone of polite but unmistakable wariness, the careful, watchful tone of established civilizations still deciding whether the newcomers could truly be trusted with anything that mattered, began, slowly, to shift. A widely circulated editorial published by a prominent Farron's Reach commentator, translated and retranslated across dozens of member species news networks in the weeks that followed, put it more bluntly than most. We have spent years quietly wondering whether humanity's rapid rise to interstellar relevance represented a genuine asset to this Concorde, or merely an unpredictable variable we had not yet learned to properly assess. This incident, paradoxically, has answered that question more clearly than a decade of careful diplomacy ever could. Humanity is capable of catastrophic error, profoundly, spectacularly capable of it, in ways few species in recorded conquered history have matched. But they are equally, perhaps even more remarkably, capable of owning that error completely, without excuse, without deflection, and working with a stubborn, almost obsessive determination until it is fixed. A civilization's worth is not measured by the mistakes it never makes. It is measured by what it does in the hours after making one. By that measure, Humanity has, however, unintentionally, passed a test far more meaningful than any formal evaluation this Concord could have designed. It was, Director Osei would later say, the single strangest compliment she had ever read in her entire career, a species being congratulated, essentially, for how well they'd cleaned up their own historic mess. But she'd take it. After 3 weeks like the ones they'd just had, she'd take pretty much any compliment she could get. Priya kept her job in the end. Director Osei fought harder for that outcome than Priya ever fully learned the details of, though she also became, somewhat to her lasting embarrassment, the answer to an entire genre of jokes that would follow her for the rest of her career. She didn't mind it as much as she expected to. There was something almost freeing about having already survived the single worst professional mistake statistically possible to make, and having the galaxy keep turning anyway. What she minded far less was the small quiet change that came out of the whole disaster. Every single piece of critical infrastructure in Concord space now had, by unanimous and slightly traumatized agreement, a mandatory documented owner, a regular audit schedule, and this part had been Priya's suggestion offered half-jokingly during one of the final hearings and adopted to her genuine surprise completely seriously. A clearly labeled, unmistakably obvious visual difference between any test environment and anything remotely resembling production infrastructure. A distinction so blunt and impossible to miss that the Concord's own engineers privately joked it had been designed specifically to survive contact with a sleep-deprived human at 4 a.m. You know? Priya told Marcus Webb months later over coffee at a station cafeteria that had, in the wake of everything, become something of an informal gathering spot for everyone who'd lived through those 3 chaotic weeks. I used to think the scariest thing in the galaxy was some ancient alien superweapon or a black hole, or a species that hated us on sight. Turns out the scariest thing was just nobody checking the smoke detector for 11,000 years. To be fair, Marcus said, that's kind of the scariest thing in every galaxy in every era forever. Somebody always forgets to check the smoke detector. We just happened to be the ones standing closest to it when it finally went off. Priya raised her coffee mug, a new one, replacing the one she'd shattered that first terrible night, in a small, tired toast. To checking the smoke detector, she said. To checking the smoke detector, Marcus agreed. She received some months later an unexpected message routed all the way from the Concord's Emergency Oversight Committee. Not a formal reprimand, as she'd half-braced herself for even after everything, but a short, uncharacteristically personal note from Administrator Vex Ilthara itself. It read in its entirety, I have reviewed your proposal regarding mandatory environment labeling and audit scheduling for critical infrastructure. It has been adopted unanimously across all 41 member species currently maintaining Concord systems. I confess I did not expect the engineer responsible for the largest administrative failure in this Concord's recorded history to also be the one who ensured it could never happen quite the same way again. I remain, for the record, unconvinced that your species is as institutionally cautious as I would prefer. I am, however, considerably more convinced than I was 3 weeks ago that caution is not the only quality worth valuing in a civilization. V. Ilthara. Priya read it twice, printed it out on actual paper for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate even to herself, and pinned it to the wall of her tiny station quarters, right above the small, embarrassingly earnest reminder she'd taped up the very first week back at work, a handwritten sticky note in her own handwriting that simply read, check which environment you're in. And somewhere far above them all, quietly humming along in newly documented, newly monitored, newly and thoroughly audited safety, 3,014 star systems kept turning, exactly as they always had, a little wiser, a little more careful, and forever in every corner of Concord space just slightly nervous around anyone holding a keyboard at 4 a.m. Years later, when new engineers joined the series relay station's night rotation, the veteran staff had developed something of a tradition. Before letting any newcomer touch a live terminal unsupervised for the first time, someone would walk them past a small, unassuming plaque bolted to the wall near the main server room entrance, easy to miss unless you already knew to look for it. It read, simply, check which environment you're in. A lesson this station learned the hard way so you wouldn't have to. Most new hires laughed when they first read it, assuming it was some kind of inside joke. A bit of gallows humor left over from an old incident nobody quite remembered the details of anymore. It was only later, usually during their first proper orientation briefing, that someone would finally explain exactly what had happened here once, on one very ordinary-seeming night shift, and exactly how close an entire galaxy had come to permanent administrative chaos over nothing more dramatic than a mislabeled test environment and a very tired engineer trying to do her job well. By then, most of them had already developed the habit the plaque was there to instill, the small automatic 3-second pause, every single time, to double-check exactly which environment they were actually looking at before they hit enter on anything that mattered. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of lesson anyone would ever put in a recruitment poster. But it was, in its own quiet way, the single most valuable thing that came out of the entire disaster. A whole galaxy, just slightly more careful, one habit at a time. Thanks so much for sticking with us through this one. If the idea of an entire galaxy going down because of one bad database migration made you laugh as much as it made us laugh writing it, do us a favor and hit like. Drop a comment with your own worst "I definitely thought this was the test environment" story. And subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Take care out there, and remember, always double check which environment you're actually in. See you in the next story.